I'm very pleased to have as a special guest the former Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Warren Burger. Mr. Chief Justice, it's a pleasure to be with you again, and as you know, this is being taped for a conference being held at Dana College in Nebraska in a few days, where they're going to be meeting, talking about prison policy, sentencing policies, what we're doing right and wrong in our country. And I'd like to open with a quote that you gave the New York Bar Association in 1970. You said, "We take on a burden when we put a man behind walls, and that burden is to give him a chance to change. If we deny him that, we deny him his status as a human being, and to deny him that is to diminish our humanity and plant the seeds of future anguish for ourselves." 1970, when you said that, there were 328,000 people in prison. By 1980, that was up to 513,000. Last year, or 1991 rather, it was up to 1,248,000, almost 4 times as many as in 1970, and yet our violent crime rate is going up.
Well,
that's exactly right. And we have more people in prison than any other country in the world. We have a higher rate of any recorded country. We have 455 per 100,000 in prison. South Africa is second with 311 per 100,000. What do all these statistics mean?
well, what they mean is that we're not carrying out what we should have done many, many years ago, and what you find is a common practice in the Scandinavian countries. That is, to train these people when they're incarcerated. It's only about 7, 8 years ago, I took a team over to the Scandinavian countries. It included Senator Hatfield, Bob Kastenmeier from the House, and then the head of the Federal Prison Bureau, a number of other people interested in the subject. Now they have a simpler problem in those countries because 90% of the prisoners in Sweden are Swedes, 90% of those in Denmark are Danes. We have a mixed problem. But basically for 100 years and more, they start training a person as soon as he comes in, if he doesn't have a trade. And when he goes out, he's got something to sell, a marketable skill. Now, we've done that in your state. You've done pretty well in the state prisons. Wisconsin has done pretty well. Minnesota's done pretty well. But by and large, over the country, we put them in a warehouse. And I've said we shouldn't use a warehouse. We should have a factory with a fence around it to keep them in, but a factory to train them and produce. It costs more to keep a person in prison in this country today for a year than to keep them in Harvard or Yale or Princeton.
Which is an incredible statistic.
Incredible. And for the most part across the country as a whole, we aren't doing anywhere near enough on the training. Now there we run into a problem. I've read some news stories recently about people objecting to the slave labor products from coming into this country from China. I have visited prisons, I think I've told you this before, in every country in Europe except Spain and Portugal, where at the time I was doing that visiting, they weren't very hospitable. And I visited them in Japan and in China. China made more sense than most of them. That's where I got this theme of factories with fences. They don't build prisons. They take a factory and put a couple of fences around it, and everybody works.
And in our country, the reality is if you go in without the ability to read and write, you're probably going to come out without the ability to read and write.
In most of the systems.
Yeah, yeah.
And now they're so overloaded with the new problems that it's been difficult for them to take on additional burdens. But they ought to start immediately. Curious thing, when I visited the Soviet Union as the guest of the, I think it was of the president of their Supreme Court, I'd said in advance to Ambassador Dobrynin I want to see prisons, mental institutions, and courts. That was a dozen years ago at least. Brezhnev was president and chief and chairman. When I'd ask, when are we going to visit the prisons? Too far away. How about the mental institutions? Too far away. And of course there's one mental institution, the biggest one, right across the street from the Kremlin. Finally, when I kept pressing, they took me to a juvenile prison about 50, 60 miles out of Moscow. And the amazing contradiction, the experts in Denmark and Sweden told me it's the best juvenile prison in the world. Youngsters from 14 to 19, not shoplifters or vandalists, committing vandalism, but murder, rape, robbery, violent crimes. First thing they get in, they test them to see how close they are to a high school education. If they're below it, they start them right away. And they work them 10 hours a day until they've got the equivalent of a high school education. Then they put them to work on mechanical drawing and from there to machinery. And the director said to me, our graduates can work in any factory in the Soviet Union. So I turned to our interpreter and said, is graduates your word or his? He came back and said the same word as though he were speaking of the graduates of the University of Moscow. Now, this man was not a typical communist by any means. He was a professional. And that's what we've got to do.
But it shows an attitude.
An attitude, yeah.
Janet Reno, the new Attorney General, as a prosecuting attorney down there, I read an article she wrote about 4 years ago. She suggested that we ought to incarcerate the career criminals, but people, for example, who are arrested on a drug charge for the first time or that sort of thing, ought to be, the treatment and evaluation and non-penal assignment.
No, I think I'd go along with that if, on the drug side, if it isn't selling drugs. The really commercial distribution of drugs ought to be treated almost like a capital crime because they don't destroy one person's life, they destroy
many lives,
thousands of lives.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of a distinction that we've got to make. I think I'd agree generally with her.
What about the business? You know, when we're in public office, we like to look like we're tough on crime, and everyone wants to be tough on crime. And so we impose mandatory sentences. Is this wise public policy, or should we have guidelines giving judges greater flexibility?
There, Senator, you're talking about one of the most difficult problems that judges have had. In my spare time when I was on the Court of Appeals, I used to go and sit on the trial court because at that time we didn't have the local court system. This is 25 years ago and more. And the sentencing was the most difficult part of the whole thing. And of course I've reviewed thousands and thousands of criminal cases. One of the difficulties was that as nearly as you could graph and use statistical methods on sentencing, it was up and down. Some judge who thought that drugs was the worst thing in the world would want to give a life sentence. If another judge thought some other crime was a more terrible crime. We had to do something with that sentencing statute. Now, like everything in a democracy, the first time you try it, it may not be the best, and it's got to be worked on. But I wouldn't abandon the idea of some standards for the judges on sentencing. You can't have the tremendous variation. For example, I recall a judge when I was sitting on another circuit This judge was known to think that gambling was the worst crime, worse than murder or rape or anything else. Gamblers got huge sentences. Rapists and bank robbers, not so much.
Very subjective kind of a thing.
So there's got to be some control of the sentencing, but and that sentencing commission was a very good group of people, very competent.
But some flexibility for the judges.
And they've got maybe to take another look at it.
What about one of the other charges is that there really are severe racial disparities in sentencing. You've undoubtedly reflected on that too.
I doubt it.
You don't think
very
so?
Much.
Yeah.
Now you may find in some states where you've had a long history of racism, you might find some traces of it there. On the other hand, my observation over recent years is that the South has responded in many respects more favorably to the new problems than some of the northern states. Perhaps because the northern states didn't have that much experience with it, and they had no racial problems until the last 30 or 40 years. I doubt that there is any very clear pattern of racism in sentencing.
What if tomorrow Warren Burger, let's say you were 45 years old and tomorrow the governor of Minnesota or the governor of Virginia or Nebraska says you're in charge of the penal system, and he's going to give you a blank check. You make the penal system whatever you would like it to be.
I'd start out with the Chinese approach, factories with fences, and see that every prisoner who came in first had basic education so that he was literate. An enormous proportion of these prisoners, 1 million plus, can't read or write or spell. So I'd do just what the Russians did, interestingly. I'd see that they've got a basic education, and then I'd start teaching them a trade.
And what about you've reflected on this, I'm sure. The criticism is always whatever they produce is going to compete with people on the outside.
That can be controlled. That can be controlled. You can see to it by statute that they can't dump on the market at below market price. Now, Nebraska is one situation I know about firsthand. I've been down there a couple of times, and that was just in recent years. There, prison products can only be sold to the cities and the counties and the school districts and the state. That's one way to control it. In the federal system, as you probably know, chairs and tables and things like this that are made in the federal prison are all taken up by the federal government. Now, that takes some market away from the private group. I've talked with some of the labor leaders about this over the years, and they are coming around to doing something like this. If it is controlled so that they can't dump it on the market below market prices, and perhaps do some limiting producing goods that the government needs.
What about, there are some moves toward using the term boot camp for younger people, younger prisoners particularly. Any reaction to that?
Yes, I'd try it with the young ones. Take a town like Washington, and when we see the terrible criminal record going on here, and there are many other cities like it, most of these kids don't really know what they're doing. They're doing it because the other kids are doing it. They're themselves, most of them, not truly literate. They're dropouts from schools. I'd try something like that and see how it works.
Well, you may not care to comment on this next, and if you don't, just say so. But the two aspects that clearly give us a higher rate of violent crime than many other countries are, number one, the problem of drugs that we have talked about, The second problem is the proliferation of weapons. Any reflections on that?
Nothing outrages me more than the conduct of the National Rifle Association, the NRA group. I read in the morning paper they fired their main lobbyist because he peddled some negative rumors about the Attorney General nominee. The fact is, they have trained themselves and their people to lie about this problem. And I can't use any word less than lie. The notion that registering gun purchases somehow violates the Constitution is unmitigated nonsense. Now, there's nothing in the Constitution about automobiles. And of course we know that you can't have an automobile except that when you buy it, it's registered. When you sell it, it's registered. You can trace the genealogy of an automobile. Why not the same thing with a gun? It's much more needed there. And they're both dangerous instruments when they get in the wrong hands. And I was astonished with what I've been reading about my present home state of Virginia, selling one a month. Why does anyone need another gun once a month?
Yeah.
Now, I have guns. I've been, when I lived in Minnesota, I hunted and ducks and pheasants and a lot of things. And always had guns in the house, handguns and rifles and shotguns. When I moved into Virginia, at the time I went on the Court of Appeals, I wrote a letter to the sheriff or someone and said, "Where do I register my guns?" He wrote back and said, "Nowhere." This is an incredible thing, and the pernicious, and I can't think of a stronger word. If you can think of one, I'll add it. The pernicious influence and conduct of the NRA is something that outrages me as an American citizen.
Well, I share your outrage, and it is to defend, for example, these automatic and semi-automatic weapons. I'm in hunting territory. I live down in rural southern Illinois. You visited Nashville, Illinois, I know, one time with Justice Blackmun. But I'm around hunters all the time. I've never seen a hunter with an AK-47 or an Uzi or any of these things.
And a real hunter shouldn't want a repeating gun other than a double-barrel shotgun or possibly the automatic with a half a dozen shells. I've never used anything but a double barrel in hunting. That ought to be part of the sport. And I think we could legislate on that. Say that no hunting license can be issued for the use of a gun more than a double or more than 5 shots or 6 shots, something like that. Deer hunters don't use machine guns.
And it's very interesting in Illinois. We have a 3-day waiting period to buy a handgun. 2 years ago, 2,470 convicted felons were denied the right to buy a handgun because of a 3-day waiting period. But the difficulty is they can just go into a neighboring state if they're turned down in Illinois. But that is clearly one problem. Again, you're speaking through this medium of that camera to a group of people concerned about penal problems gathered in Nebraska from around the nation. If we really made an effort, not just to build places to incarcerate and, you know, lock people up and throw the key away, but did more constructive things, what would be the net effect in the country?
I think it, over a period of time, have an enormous impact. In Minnesota, when I was a youngster, worked for a boys' camp when I was about 14 years old, and one of my jobs was to take a bunch of kids close to my age or a little younger in the big war canoe up the St. Croix River and stop at Stillwater, Minnesota, where they had the great and one of the most modern prisons in the country. And there they were making parts for machinery for one of the big companies in Minnesota that produced farm machinery. that's been continued over the years. Now, no one has ever done a study on what happens to these people in terms of training when they get out. Do they go to work for the same kind of an occupation? I don't know. But the states that have done this and the federal system, which is the best of all, have demonstrated that they can cut criminal activity of these inmates in the future.
Of the people who go out, and
well,
virtually all go out.
Well, sooner or later.
Yeah. One final question. What got you interested in this whole area?
I suppose as a kid, when I went up to that prison, 14 years old, at that time they didn't allow the prisoners to talk to each other. They learned to speak the way a ventriloquist does, which outraged me. And I remember another thing, looking at the walls around the prison, they were slanted, and they were highly polished Minnesota granite. And I remember the guard saying to us, look at that wall, a fly can't walk up that wall. They can't get out. That was, to me, the wrong emphasis. It should have been on the factories with fences concept. Then when I came to Washington as Assistant Attorney General, I met Jim Bennett, who was head of the Federal Prison Bureau for about 30 years, a man who was way ahead of his time. He got me interested in visiting more American prisons, which I did, but emphasis on the Scandinavian prisons, Sweden and Denmark and Finland, and the Netherlands and Germany. As you go south in Europe, the prisons get more like the American prisons, no occupational training. Then watching what they did in Sweden, which is probably the best, they come out of that prison and can get a job as a carpenter or a boat builder or whatever. And which is interesting because they have shorter sentences than we do generally in that country. Of course, they don't have as much violent crime either, so there isn't the need for the long sentences.
And they don't have the proliferation of weapons that
No.
we have. Yeah.
And that is something I must say that the Congress has got to get at, and so do the states. I think that you people here in Congress could tighten it up on interstate transportation of weapons.
Well, I think we have to do a better job, but it is, you hit the nub of it. The National Rifle Association has convinced so many good citizens that if we take any steps, we're going to take their guns away. And of course, that's pure nonsense.
I have several good friends, very intelligent people, who argue with me. And they think my attitude is too rigid, and then I bring it back to the automobile. Do you object to the fact that you have to register your automobile? And if you sell it, go through this process? Well, they have no answer for that. And, there is no real constitutional question here. The NRDA has convinced a lot of people that the right to bear arms is an absolute right. It is not, any more than the right to have an automobile is an absolute right. The provision in the Constitution was drawn against the attitude of the people of that day who did not want a national army. We had state armies, and they were afraid of a national army because that was the source of oppression in the European countries. And that was the purpose of the amendment, to see to it that people, mature people, would know how to use firearms. And of course, in that day, firearms was a source of food for a lot of the people, too. The whole thing has changed. And if, as John Marshall said, we have a living constitution that we can change to meet the new problems of airplanes and outer space, we can change our approach to dealing with guns.
Mr. Chief Justice, on behalf of the people gathered at Dana College in Nebraska, I thank you. very, very much.
Pleasure to be here with you, Senator.
Thank you.
I'm sorry I can't make the trip.
I wish you could too, but you're with us in spirit, and you're with us with this message.
Thank you.